Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you are joining us today. My name is Jessica Hunt, and on behalf of the entire team at Environment and Energy Leader, we welcome you to today's webinar, Guaranteed Returns in PJM inside Grimbion's 73,000 megawatt year ELRP price floor program. Yes, that was a mouthful. Good thing that I'm not going to be speaking specifically on this topic and that you have um, subject matter experts that will be joining us as soon as I go over through some housekeeping items with all of attendees that are on with us today. Right now, you are going to see a poll question that pops up on your screen. If you could do us a favor when we eventually pop that up, it'll probably be in a minute or so. If you could fill that out, that would be great. It helps us guide our Q&A for later in today's session. Just a few reminders, if this is the first time that you have ever attended an E&E Leader webinar, all of our webinars are recorded. You will be able to come back later on and rewatch this. You will get a link from Zoom, as well as you'll be able to watch this again on additional platforms. We really appreciate all active participation in our events. So please submit any and all questions that you have for our speakers using the Q&A widget that is at the bottom of your screen. We will do our very best to get to all of the questions before the top of the hour. That being said, more than likely, we will not get to every question. So if we do not, a member or members of the team will follow up with you as soon as possible. In the chat section, let us know where you're joining from, and we look forward to a great event. At this point, I'm going to turn today's webinar over to Nick, and I will rejoin everybody for the Q&A.
Thank you, Jessica, and thank you everyone for taking the time to join this webinar today. Really excited to be sharing what we're bringing to market today in PJM for our enhanced payment program. Before we get kicked off, just as a way of introduction, so my name is Nick Way. I am the PJM Business Development Director here at GridBeyond. So I help support customers in not only demand response, which is going to be the bulk of what we talk about today, but also other opportunities such as peak avoidance, real-time price avoidance, and behind-the-meter battery storage. I'm delighted to have Nicholas Fresky on the call as well, and Stephen Chambers. Nicholas is joining us from Gable Associates and Stephen from Constellation Energy. From my side today, just to give everyone an overview, so I will be taking charge of talking through, who we are here at GridBeyond, where are we coming from, where are we going, and then I will be talking through what specifically are we bringing to market today for the PJM Emergency Load Response Program. Nicholas and Steve, I'm going to pass it to you just to do a brief introduction before you guys take the opportunity to speak for your portions, and then we'll get kicked off here.
Awesome. Thank you, Nick. Thanks for the introduction. So I'm Nicholas Fresky. I'm a director at Gable Associates. Gable is an energy consulting firm. Our three main areas of focus are wholesale markets, regulatory and policy, and behind the meter work. I'm specifically work in the research, analytics, and modeling team. So I provide a lot of the quantitative analysis behind all three of these groups. And today I'm going to give a little bit of background on PJM's capacity markets and the factors that have been causing prices to rise.
Right, and then thank you all for joining us today. Thanks to GridBeyond and E&E Leader for inviting me to speak on this webinar. My name's Stephen Chambers. I'm a principal on Constellation's commercialization and development team. I've been with Constellation for 15 years. I've spent most of my time at Constellation working directly with our largest commercial and industrial customers, right, helping them manage their energy spend and market risk strategies. Currently, I lead our demand side management program through our commercial collaboration with GridBeyond. So I work very closely with Nick and the GridBeyond team on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, Nicholas. So jumping in here, just to give everyone a little background on who GridBeyond is, where we're coming from, and where we're going. So at our core, I think it's important to note that GridBeyond is a controls and hardware company. So we got our start as a company working with industrial customers, like a lot of folks on the call here today, that wanted a better way to both monitor their facilities and control their facilities through remote toggling capability. Through the past 10 to 15 years, with the development of demand response programs, both in Europe and here in the US, it's really allowed for us to position us as a company to not only work with companies for either, say, demand response or controls and hardware, but to combine them both together such that when these demand response events are happening, or peak events, or real-time price avoidance opportunities, there's no longer this scramble of what do I do, when do I do it, and how do I do it. We are taking care of all of that upfront work with every customer that we work with so that there's a predetermined plan put in place such that when these events happen, there's no longer that scramble, right? Folks know what to do and how to do it. I'd say the different pillars that we're focused on here today, right? I think for the bulk of the conversation today, we're going to be talking about the capacity demand response program in PJM, and that's the emergency load response program. But outside of this demand response program, we're working with customers across the US for, more sophisticated, faster responding programs. So we call those ancillary markets. On top of that, we do predictive analytics for both capacity and transmission peak avoidance. So for folks on the phone today who have plants in PJM, we do provide zonal transmission peak forecasting for every node zone in PJM, which is becoming more and more important as we see transmission costs rising year over year. And then for folks who have exposure to the real-time energy market, so if you want to try to avoid high-priced hours on the grid, we also do load forecasting that's going to predict high-priced hours before they happen. And we do that through our short-term models that go out 7 days. And then we also work with customers to develop long-term forecasting models to describe what is the specific ISO going to look like, not necessarily the next 2 weeks, but the next month, the next 6 months, the next year. So why are we all here today? I think most people are on this call today because we're seeing a huge increase in capacity costs in PJM. Before I pass this over to Nicholas to talk through more about this, I think just to set the groundwork for what are these capacity costs doing, I'd say for 3 things. One, these capacity costs are setting the base payment that PJM is willing to pay generators for producing electricity in PJM. 2, these capacity costs are translating to what every manufacturer is being exposed to on their bills for their contribution towards the grid peaks each summer. And then 3, this is setting the base payment for the demand response program that we're going to be discussing today, which is the emergency load response program. Nicholas, I'm going to pass this over to you now just to do a brief overview of, what is PJM, why are we seeing a big increase in capacity costs, and really what the future is going to be looking like.
Great, thank you, Nick. Yeah, just a quick overview of what is PJM. So PJM can be considered the largest machine on Earth. It is over 1,100 interconnected power plants that cover a large part of the eastern United States. And you can see this map on the right here. We're probably all located somewhere in there. And PJM essentially functions as a stock market for electricity. It sets the price for all of us paying utility bills in the region. And PJM operates under the mandate that it must provide affordable and reliable electricity to the 60 million people who live in its territory. And you can go to the next slide, Nick. Thank you. So when we talk about reliability in PJM, electricity is a really interesting product because electricity is delivered in the same exact instant that it's created, right? It travels at the speed of light from the power plant to the end user. So to contend with this problem, you can't use traditional supply-demand dynamics. You need to plan ahead into the future. So you need to start building power plants today that are going to be providing electricity years in the future when we need them. In order to do this, PJM's solution is they have an auction every year where they essentially look at what they believe the demand is going to be on the grid in a future year. And then they ask power plants to essentially commit to providing electricity years in advance. And they are essentially paid the capacity price for making this commitment. They say, hey, we promise we'll give you, $100,000, $200,000 per megawatt per year if you promise that you're going to provide electricity when we call on you. If power plants make this promise and they get paid all this money and then the grid calls on them and they don't show up, they get penalized because essentially they were paid and didn't provide the reliability that they were compensated for. So in 2022, there was a winter storm in which this exact scenario happened. And essentially, PJM called up a bunch of different power plants of all different resource types during this winter storm. And a lot of people didn't show up. And it made PJM reevaluate how they were accrediting capacity on the grid because they essentially look at the total amount of capacity available. And when a bunch of power plants didn't show up, they reevaluated and they said, oh, we actually have less reliable capacity available than we thought. At the same time, you started to see the beginnings of the rising demand due to data centers. And that essentially lowered supply and raised demand at the same time. And you saw, and you see on this graph here to the right, from 2024, 2025 energy year to 2025, 2026, you see a 10 times increase in capacity cost. And this was a huge kind of unexpected price spike in PJM. So then you fast forward to today, and all of the factors that kind of led to that price spike a couple auctions ago are now kind of even more solid. Instead of getting alleviated, they've all gotten worse. The emergence of generative AI has kind of created this huge unprecedented growth in load in PJM. And this upcoming auction, PJM is expected to be short on capacity for the first time in its history. It essentially means that there's not enough capacity to meet the reliability requirement that PJM has. If you take a look at the graph on the right, this is the kind of modeling that myself and our firm does when we look at capacity markets, and the squiggly lines are all the different scenarios of the quantity of supply that we could see offering into the upcoming auction. This auction actually opens today, and this is going to set the price for 2027, 2028 energy year. And you could see we simulated 1,000 scenarios, and 99.9% of them, there wasn't enough energy in PJM to meet the demand. So right now, you can see this dashed black line that represents for the last auction for 27, 28, for 26, 27 and 27, 28, PJM put an artificial cap on the price that they're going to allow the auction to clear at because prices went up so fast, so quickly that they wanted to provide some relief to ratepayers. But those caps are going to go away. And you could see in this graph, the difference between that black line and then the higher green line at the top is going to be the jump in capacity prices, essentially when PJM stops artificially limiting it. So all signs are pointing right now to rising capacity costs in PJM. So looking forward over like a 10-year forecast, what we've seen essentially is each passing month, we see that these AI and data center load growth forecasts are more and more solid. Like we believe in them more and more that these projects are actually getting built. At the same time, PJM has 35 gigawatts of coal power plants that are over 50 years old. And a lot of these plants, despite these super high capacity prices, are retiring because they're just reaching the end of their mechanical life. PJM is also having a lot of trouble getting new power plants built. There's a lot of regulatory barriers, and it's also difficult just to study building new plants, how they're going to interconnect to the grid. It takes several years, and right now there's just an extreme shortage of capacity today. You could take a look at the graph on the right, and that kind of shows, and like I said, we like to simulate thousands of scenarios of how the market could play out. So you could see the dark line in the middle is kind of our median case, and then even our extreme tails of our forecast, you could see that the end of the 10-year period, we still are seeing capacity prices being as high as they are today. And that jump from 27, 28 to 28, 29, like I said earlier, is the end of that price cap that PJM put in. So you're going to see the real cost of capacity shoot up probably starting in 2028. So now I'm going to hand the mic over to Steve Chambers, who's going to talk a little bit about some of the potential solutions to this capacity shortage.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nicholas. That was really informative, a great lead in. To get started, just for anyone that doesn't know, right? Constellation, we're the nation's largest producer of emissions-free, 24/7, reliable energy, and we're a leading energy supplier to commercial and industrial, residential, and public sector customers with a very heavy presence in PJM in particular. I want to pull back the curtain a little bit as to how Constellation and Grid Beyond came to work together, right? So about 2 years ago, right, given our position in PJM as the largest generator, load-serving entity, we foresaw a lot of the current energy market dynamics that are taking place, which Nicholas just spoke to, right? We also heard loud and clear from all of our customers about the pain points that they were having, right? Namely, capacity and transmission costs were going up, in some cases through the roof. Customers were managing through an increasing likelihood of scarcity pricing events, especially when there was extreme weather. There's significant load growth expected in PJM for the first time in over a decade, right? And at the end of the day, our customers are looking for solutions to help them manage their budgets and their risk. So led by our Constellation Technologies Ventures team, we did a survey of all of the technologies out there in the demand side management space. And really what we wanted to do was leverage advanced technology, predictive analytics, and bring new value add demand side solutions to our customers. So we were really and still are actively working with Grid Beyond to bring to our customers a smarter way that improves on the old methods of participating in demand response. So eventually, the evaluation of the space led us to an investment and a commercial collaboration with Grid Beyond. And after working with them for 2 years, we at Constellation have a real conviction that their technology and their approach to the DR space is cutting edge, and it's a differentiator in the market. So again, we've been collaborating with Grid Beyond for about 2 years now. We've designed commercial programs that can add value for Constellation's customers, especially those that have load flexibility or behind-the-meter assets. So relevant to our discussion of capacity markets and PJM in particular, we have two commercial offerings of focus here. Number one is what we call peak response. You may know it as peak shaving or peak avoidance. That is a program in which customers receive accurate and timely notifications of the peak hours on the grid that will set their capacity and transmission obligations, right? So if you can curtail load or utilize a behind-the-meter asset during those hours, it lowers your on-bill cost of capacity and transmission. And then the other program, which is a focus of today's conversation, is participation in a formal demand response program that's offered by a grid operator, right? In this case, in PJM, it's emergency load response. So we at Constellation are very excited about this collaboration with Grid Beyond. And we're excited to bring you the unique opportunity that Nick Guay will be talking about today. So moving on to why demand response is important, right? Why are we emphasizing it at Constellation? Why are we bringing you this offering through our collaboration with Grid Beyond, right? As I'm sure most of you are well aware at this point, we're undergoing a massive period of load growth across the US, but in the PJM footprint in particular. And this is important because it follows a decade or more where load growth was flat to negative. So AI data centers are obviously the largest contributor to the growth projections, but you also have to consider onshoring of manufacturing and electrification in general, which are also strong contributors. So you can see on the map here how heavily data centers are focused in PJM, right? PJM currently hosts about 40% of the total US data center capacity. And PJM also predicts another 30 gigawatts of data center capacity being added by 2030. To put that in perspective, that equates to 20% growth versus PJM's current peak load, right? Within the next 5 years. So there's a lot of load growth coming. And I would say, make no mistake, right? We're in the very early stages of seeing this load growth materialize. So this summer, for example, during that heat dome event we had in the third week of June, peak load in PJM hit 161 gigawatts. That's the highest peak load in PJM in 14 years. And it also exceeded PJM's pre-summer estimate of their peak load by 5%. So, obviously, if you're an energy consumer, this type of load growth, right, creates concerns about reliability, about future costs. And so we at Constellation, through working with Grid Beyond, are trying to do our part to help, right? So amongst the other things that we've announced, Constellation is investing in the growth of demand response in PJM as a tool to preserve grid reliability and ultimately bring value to our customers. And this all goes back to a study by Duke University, right? The importance of DR. Duke University in this study found that the grid could actually absorb quite a significant amount of new load if large energy users were financially incentivized to curtail their usage in only a handful of hours each year, right? And the reason for this is that during most hours of the year, right, the grid has plenty of spare headroom, right? Power plants sit idle a lot of the time. Think of fall and the spring, where loads are at their lowest during the year, right? The problem with enabling this load growth, right, it comes during those handful of critical peak hours, right? When the grid is stressed, you're, in an extreme summer or winter weather event, right? That's when, you run into potential problems with all of this load growth. But to the point of the Duke study, demand response is an ideal tool to help the grid manage through these peak load events, right? So as opposed to building a new power plant, which can be expensive, it could take many years, DR, demand response, is a lever that grid operators can pull in the very near term to help manage through this load growth. So Constellation, we're collaborating, we've announced this publicly, we're collaborating with customers to build a portfolio of a gigawatts worth of AI-enabled demand response capacity through Grid Beyond, right? That equates to about a full nuclear unit's worth of output in terms of DR in the PJM market. And as Nick will be talking about, to reach this goal, we're offering DR resources a financial incentive to participate in the PJM capacity market for an extended term, right? This helps PJM really ensure that the capacity will be there in the market for the next decade when it's needed the most. So with that, I'm excited to flip this back over to Nick Way to talk through the incentive program that we're offering for demand response.
Yep. Thank you, Steve. And so what does this program look like? Not necessarily just for the short term, while capacity prices remain incredibly high, but also for the long term. If we do see capacity prices stabilize to what they used to be at the 10-year historic average of, say, $45,000 per megawatt year. And so what we're bringing to market for PJM in particular is really two things. The first thing that we're instituting to incentivize long-term stable performance in the PJM Emergency Load Response Program is the institution of a capacity price floor of $73,000 per megawatt year. What this price floor means is, at a minimum, for the duration of our agreements for our customers that were signing up for our program, no matter what, our customers are going to be paid $73,000 per megawatt year for their contribution towards their curtailment for demand response. On top of that, if we do see capacity prices remain incredibly high, like they are today and likely going to be for the foreseeable future, we are paying customers the greater of the price floor. And on top of that, if prices do clear above our capacity price floor of $73,000 per megawatt year, we are paying customers 100% of that revenue. So with the backing of Constellation Energy, we are essentially getting out of the revenue share game. So for many customers who are on the phone today, most demand response providers in North America, they operate off a percentage revenue share, where the customer or the manufacturing load that's curtailing for demand response commands the lion's share of all revenue for their participation. And typically we see that around 70, 75% or 80% of revenue, and then the provider would absorb the remaining balance for facilitating the program. We are getting out of that game. We are offering 100% demand response revenue for participation in our program, while also instituting this capacity price floor of $73,000 per megawatt year. If you look prior to what we're seeing for 25/6, this $73,000 per megawatt year, relative to what we've seen over the past decade in PJM, the highest it's been is back in 2016-17, around $60,000 per megawatt year. So right away, our customers are getting roughly a $13,000 increase of a premium price floor payment relative to what we've seen over the past decade. To sort of ease some questions that we've gotten from customers in initial conversations, right? 100% of the revenue share, a price floor. Is this the same program as I'm participating in today? To answer that question, yes. So this program that we are instituting and bringing to market is absolutely no different than the emergency load response program that exists today. And so the nature of this program, the emergency load response program, it is an emergency load response program, right? This program is called during real system-wide grid emergencies. So think of brownouts, blackouts, voltage constraint. This is essentially the last line of defense that PJM has before they need to institute those localized brownouts, blackouts, and voltage constraint. And so starting on the right-hand side here, what this program is offering is not only advance notice of emergency situations on the grid before it happens, but you are being incentivized to safely curtail your facility such that if an emergency event happens, not only are you in the loop and aware of this emergency event, but you're being paid for your flexibility to curtail during these emergencies. Outside of emergency events, so typically over the past 10 years, right, we have seen the emergence of increased emergency events, but over the past 10 years, really what we've seen from PJM is this testing requirement. And the way that this testing requirement works, working in demand response for the past decade, it is still relatively lax in the fact that it is a single 2-hour test event each year. And so this test event will serve as your essentially, proof for if an emergency event were to happen, would your facility be able to show up? And what's nice about this testing requirement is that we receive notice from PJM a week ahead before a 2-week testing window opens for your facility to be tested. So once you receive that week ahead notice of a 2-week window, you will then receive a day ahead notice saying tomorrow you will have your demand response test event. On the day of the test event, customers will receive either a 30-minute lead time, a 60-minute lead time, or a 120-minute lead time. And a lot of that has to do with the type of manufacturing process that you're curtailing. So if you cannot safely bring down your facility within a 30-minute lead time notice, we can work with PJM to qualify you for an hour lead time or a 2-hour lead time. Something just to touch on, right? So looking beyond the 25-6 capacity planning year, right? So starting this year, PJM instituted what they call an ELCC, or an effective load carrying capacity. And what the effective load carrying capacity is the percentage discount that PJM applies to any resource that bids into the PJM capacity auction, fully knowing that this resource is not going to be available 100% of the time. And so for this year, 25-6, the ELCC is 77%. And then moving into 26-7 for the next delivery year, it is reducing to 69%. And then starting in 27-8, which is really when we're trying to go live for this type of program, the ELCC is increasing to 92%, which is incredibly high. And this has to do with this emergency load response program becoming a 24/7 program requirement. So if you're participating in demand response today and you are essentially not set up for this type of 24/7 response notice, you're essentially handicapping yourself, because it's our stance here at Grid Beyond that you need to have either an autonomous or semi-autonomous curtailment strategy set up such that when these emergency events happen, you are able to respond. Something else to call out here. So starting for the 25-6 capacity planning year, we saw the institution of a capacity price floor and a capacity price cap. So what this means is for the base residual auctions that Nicholas was talking about, at a minimum, we're seeing prices clear at the 63,875, and at a maximum, we're seeing prices clear at 121,545. This price cap is expected to end starting in 27-8, which is the real value of what we're instituting with this capacity price floor, right? It is carrying through this at a minimum threshold, your payment for your participation in demand response. What I want to just draw attention to here is just the real value of what we're bringing to market here with this price floor scenario and this 100% revenue share scenario. So if we're assuming that capacity prices remain incredibly high for a long-term duration, let's just say capacity prices remain at 121,545 for the next foreseeable future. Again, most demand response companies operate in the revenue share game. And so what you can see here is based off of what revenue share you're on with your current provider today, what is the incremental value of our program compared to what you are getting today? And so one of the most aggressive revenue shares that we see across PJM is a 95.5% revenue share. So this would be you, manufacturing client, receiving 95%, the demand response provider receiving 5%. It's very attractive. It's very high. You're commanding the lion's share of that revenue. Even if you are on this most aggressive revenue share that we see out there today, our value is guaranteeing roughly $4,200 per megawatt more than a 95.5% revenue share. So incredibly competitive, incredibly attractive if prices remain high for years to come. If capacity prices do start to drop off, right, this 63,875 is the now capacity price floor. Every other demand response provider in North America will be splitting revenue on the 63,875. With Grid Beyond, with the price floor that we're instituting of $73,000 per megawatt year, our customers would be paid at the $73,000 per megawatt value minus the ELCC for an additional $11,333 per megawatt year. And this slide really represents the long-term value of what we're bringing to market, right? So the 10-year historic average of capacity prices in PJM come in around $45,000 per megawatt year. And so with the idea of wanting to incentivize stable, long-term performance in this program, if and when capacity prices do stabilize to the 10-year average, and if anyone listens to the Constellation webinars about energy pricing and market signals, one of their chief economists often says the answer to high capacity prices are high capacity prices. So capacity pricing is incredibly high right now. We're seeing over 2 gigawatts of new generation enter the market. And if and when capacity prices do stabilize, our program is going to be paying out considerably more than what capacity prices were for a 10-year historic average. And so if you compare that to what a 95.5% revenue share would be for this 10-year historic average, this is where the real value comes at, $27,000 in additional revenue compared to a 95.5% revenue share. So something just to talk through some of the agreements that we're putting in front of customers, right? So we are trying to secure long-term arrangements with customers for this price floor at 100% revenue share. Something just to call out, we will continue to collaborate with all of our customers every single year prior to the next delivery window. So we are not asking customers to deliver the same amount of megawatts every single year because we understand that operations are just, need to remain flexible and things do change. Just like with many other demand response providers here in North America, there are no out-of-pocket costs for non-performance. Simply put, if you do not perform during a demand response event, future demand response revenue will be reduced because of that underperformance. These events that we're calling, this program we're bringing to market, again, I've already said this, but just to reinforce this is absolutely no different than what many customers are doing today for the emergency load response program. So it is the same amount of curtailment hours. It is the same amount of baseline measurements, the ELCC. It is the exact same program as the emergency load response program exists today. Simply put, we're just adding an enhanced payment mechanism to that. And then lastly here, Grid Beyond being a controls and hardware company, it's our belief that we want to set our customers up for advanced metering and automation so that when these events come in, again, there's no longer that scramble of how do I respond? All of that is predetermined and pre-discussed with every customer that we work with. So for anyone on the call here today that wants to talk more about this program, this is just outlining sort of the next steps that we take with customers that want to explore enrollment in this type of program. But typically for next steps, we like to start with what we call a letter of authorization. This allows for us to reach out to your utility on your behalf so that we can request interval meter data. Once we have this data, we will do a virtual assessment of what can you be enrolled for how much, and what would the value of our program bring to your business. After we understand the enrollment capability, we will have what we call a virtual site audit, where our head of field operations will get on the call with your operations group just to talk through how you will curtail. What are you doing today, and how can we benefit your business through our controls and hardware? And then lastly, the fun part, we get to discuss the commercial terms of the agreement and what the participation is really going to look like. With that, Jessica, maybe I'll just pass it over to you to see if we've had any questions come through, and I'll leave it at this slide here to frame the conversation.
Yeah. Have we had any questions come through? We've had many questions come through. So I don't think we're actually going to be able to get to all of them, but we will do our best. This question is a very specific one for those who live in Pennsylvania. With Pennsylvania beginning the process of exiting RGGI, how do you expect this shift to influence generation investment and power supply dynamics within PJM? And for large energy users, are there any tangible implications, positive or negative, that we should anticipate over the next few auction cycles? Nick,
Yeah. Yeah. No, thanks, Jessica. There might be I think there's a lot to unpack with that one.
Yes.
And I think that one might be better served to set up a call with myself and Steve Chambers on the line here. There's a lot to talk about with that. Just so for the sake of time, maybe we take that one offline.
Okay,
Yeah,
excellent. And I
yeah,
would say, yep, sorry.
I would say we'd be happy to address that, right? Probably offline would be the better forum for that. What I will say is it's one of many shifting dynamics within the PJM market at the moment, right? And as Nicholas and Nick can say, there's a lot of uncertainty around regulatory issues across the board, especially in light of all of this load growth. So yeah, it's definitely a complex issue that will require more time than we have here today.
I had a feeling that might be what both of you would say. Nicholas, I'm going to jump over to you, and this goes back to slide 9 that you were referencing. How confident are we in the projected AI-driven load growth, and what assumptions underpin these estimates?
Yeah, sure. I could speak for that a little bit. Um, so a couple things with the AI load growth, because there's a lot of skepticism as to how real some of this data center load is going to end up being. So one source of confidence that we have is that PJM publishes their load forecast every year, but separately there's a regional transmission expansion planning process that happens, and we follow that closely as well. And that process is essentially triggered by large load interconnection requests, which are not yet reflected in PJM's load forecast. So we've seen over 20 gigawatts of large load requests through that transmission expansion planning process that we think is probably going to end up being integrated into the upcoming 2026 PJM load forecast. But that being said, we've gone back and we've modeled PJM capacity prices using the 2024 load forecast, when a lot of these large loads were not yet in the forecast, and we were still seeing capacity shortages. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that some of those other factors that I spoke to, which were PJM is accrediting its existing supply less because it has not proven to be as reliable as they were hoping it would be. There's also the retirement of a large amount of coal plants across PJM, which is contracting supply. And these plants are, like I said, mechanically at the end of their life and need to be replaced. And these high price signals are partially a signal to build new power plants of the size and scale of some of the coal that's retiring, as well as interconnection issues as far as PJM's queue takes a very long time for new power plants to get through. And this is creating a shortage of capacity as load is able to grow because there's no similar queue on the load side. They could just keep adding new load to the grid, whereas any new generation needs to go through processes at PJM, which slow it down. So there's an asymmetry there. So the AI, we do feel confident that the growth is real, but we also have reasons for believing that even without a lot of this huge AI growth that's being forecasted, we would still be experiencing these high prices in PJM.
All right. And then I know, while this was your slide, Steve and Nick, do you have anything you want to add before we move on?
No, I think Nicholas nailed it.
Absolutely.
All right, sounds good. Steve, I'm going to jump over to you, and we're sticking again with the AI theme. What misconceptions do companies still have about AI-powered load management? And can you kind of explain the financial difference between participating in PJM's demand response program and simply managing peak load on your own?
Yeah, let me start with the second, and I'll ask Nick to jump into around the AI question and how their technology, differentiates from what's in the market, right? So, yeah, again, two pathways to kind of manage your capacity costs, right? Number one is peak avoidance, right? You can curtail as much as you can during the 5 CP hours on the grid that take place from June through September every summer, right? And that will result in a savings on your commodity supply bill. The other alternative, right, is to leave your PLC alone where it is and participate in the demand response program, right, as a capacity resource. There are trade-offs for both programs, right? Historically, demand response has required fewer hours of curtailment to achieve the same value, right? But it is a mandatory program in the sense that if there's an emergency event, you have to perform, right? Or you'll be, penalized, or at least like your revenue will be reduced if for underperformance. Whereas 5CP management, completely voluntary, right? There's no penalties. Your only cost would be a missed savings opportunity if you were to not hit all 5 peaks. But again, that requires more hours of curtailment on an annual basis historically to achieve that cost savings. I also want to point out, right, that, and Nick can elaborate on this as well, PJM looks at your PLC, right, as your kind of baseline for how much capacity you can contribute to the PJM market. So you cannot manage your capacity obligation through 5CP management and do DR with the same megawatts, right? They'll cannibalize each other. So you kind of have to pick which avenue you're going to go down. There are, again, trade-offs, benefits of both ways of doing it. But it is a decision you have to make based on, your risk tolerance, the characteristics of your own load. And Grid Beyond and Constellation can help you regardless of which path you choose.
Yeah, and I think just to expand a little bit more on that, right, as you think about which avenue you want to take, right, with capacity tag management, reducing that PLC, just to frame, right, the amount of curtailment hours you'll need to achieve that. We're typically looking between 25 to 35 hours of disruption over the course of the summer to mitigate that PLC charge. When you compare that to a program like the Emergency Load Response Program, which historically has dispatched for these test events, you're looking at 2 hours of curtailment to achieve the benefits of that program. Now, if emergency events are happening, right, you could see certainly more than 2 hours of disruption over the course of the year. For heavy summers like we just saw this past summer, I think we saw around 15 hours of curtailment. But what's nice about the emergency response program is not only are you being incentivized to curtail your load during an emergency, but you are safely bringing down your facility such that if these emergency situations were to escalate to a level where you would need to have a forced outage at the facility because of the real-time demand imbalance that we're seeing, you're not only receiving advance notice of that, you're not only curtailing to safely bring down the facility, but you're getting paid for your contribution. Now, for the first part of the question, how are we using, AI to help better support our customers? Really, that comes into effect with the customers that we do support with the capacity tag management, and for customers that have exposure to high energy prices. So if you're on an index supply agreement. And so what we're doing with our own predictive analytics is, not only are we taking all of the load data that exists within PJM, but we're using AI to run our own models to determine what are we going to be seeing on the grid today and tomorrow, not based off just the PJM data alone, but also 10 years of historical data coupled with weather data, coupled with other manufacturing loads choosing to curtail 4 or 5 coincident peak. So it's no longer that world where you can just say, it's hot outside, I'm going to choose to curtail, and especially with the amount of people that are doing this today, you really need to have advanced tools that are going to tell you when these events are going to happen. And that's what we're here to do here at Grid Beyond.
Oh, that's great. And thank you both for your in-depth answer. Nick, I'm going to stick with you, and this is kind of goes along with what you were just talking about. What types of customer profiles or load shapes tend to benefit most from a program that eliminates revenue sharing and guarantees a minimum annual payout?
Yeah, great question, and I think it's a really simple answer. I'd say any organization today that is trying to manage their capacity costs, it could be, steel mills, it could be pulp and paper manufacturing, it could be commercial real estate businesses that could aggregate their loads at scale. We're not just a one-stop shop for the heavy industrials. I would say any and every customer that is focused on reducing their costs through sophisticated semi-autonomous curtailment is a good fit for this program. So anyone on the phone, I'm not sure who submitted that question, we'll send out our contact details. Let's look into it. And I would say, no customer is not a good customer.
Wow, I like that. Steve and Nicholas, do you have anything you want to add before I ask a very interesting question next?
I would just say, you do have to have flexibility, right? And be willing to be flexible, right? In order to participate, right? The reason we're offering this is we want to benefit the grid, right? And provide the grid operators with tools to help manage through those emergency events. So you definitely have to have some flexibility, but if you do, we don't care what industry vertical you're in, right? We can work with you.
No, excellent. So if I'm an industrial site and I have to produce my product to meet customer delivery deadlines, while I can occasionally handle a disruption or have experienced power outages in the past, how and why should I convince my leadership to open my company or plant to participate in demand response?
Yeah, I mean, I'd say why I think makes a lot of sense today more so than it ever has. And I think this chart here gives a great visual, right? The value that these programs are giving manufacturers today has simply never been as high, right? If we were having this conversation in 2022 or 2023 or 24, that's a much harder question to answer simply because the costs that you are associated with your peaks are not as high as they are today. Right now, seeing prices for 25.6 being around 100,000 and increasing to 120 for 26.7, this is the why, right? Prices have never been this high, and so your flexible curtailment ability has never been as valued as high as it is today. In terms of how, that's a conversation that's dependent based off of certain types of verticals, right? So I'd say depending on your type of manufacturing process, we'll have a different answer to that. I'd say one of the most common talk tracks that we use with our customers to get them not only comfortable with demand response, but to be able to sell it up to leadership internally is this idea of building up reserve stock or reserve material such that if a demand response event is forecasted or a peak or a high priced hour on the grid, what can your business do beforehand to build up stock or a silo of excess material such that when these events happen, you can turn off upstream equipment at your facility while still allowing for downstream production to remain in place. And so a lot of this comes back to the idea of predictive analytics and using our AI models to forecast when these events are going to happen before they happen. But if you have the ability to know what's going to happen before it happens, what can your business do to build up an excess reserve such that you have these materials ready to go so you can turn off upstream assets to participate while still allowing for some semblance of manufacturing to take place on the downstream? It's going to vary depending on every vertical we talk to, but we have the industry experience and we would be happy to explore it with every and any customer that wants to have that conversation.
Yeah, and I will say, I mentioned in my comments that, we're looking for a smarter way, right, to improve upon the old methods of DR, right? So the old days where you would just get a phone call and say, figure it out, right? Just go start flipping switches, right? We're trying to improve upon that through Grid Beyond, right? And they will work with customers to figure out a realistic curtailment plan and enrollment capacity, right, to minimize your operational disruption if and when an event does occur. So they really do lean on that, kind of automation, industrial controls background and their knowledge of a lot of a wide variety of industrial verticals to make that process as smooth as possible.
Excellent. And as we are having our discussion, more and more questions keep coming in. So we are more than likely going to be sending out a list of all of the questions with the answers to registrants, just to make sure that everybody has access to the information. Now, this topic wasn't specifically talked about, but can you discuss the role of BTM batteries, either being utilized for 5CP management to drive bill savings or participation in DR programs as a revenue generating resource? And where do you really see the opportunity for battery storage adoption?
Yeah, I can take that.
I want to weigh in too. It's a great question.
Yeah, I think, battery storage has never been, in PJM at least, as both profitable and necessary as it is today. So typically when we're working with customers to identify a battery storage solution, what we really start with is what is the flexible load that you have on site today? And with that flexible load that they have on site today, we have this conversation of what do you want to do to manage this flexible load? Do you want to start with demand response through this increased incentive program, or do you want to manage your capacity costs with this flexible load? Now, with this inflexible load, right, the parts of the manufacturing process that simply cannot be turned off. And so think of a cement mill, if you would, the kiln, the furnace that's running all the time to produce cement, that is simply never turning off, because if that turns off, it's going to take multiple hours, if not days, to get that unit back up to temperature. And so for this inflexible load, what we typically do is we'll size our battery storage systems to figure out, of the percentage of this inflexible load that you have at your facility, what could we size for a battery to allow for you to not only use your flexible load to curtail your facility down to a suitable level, but how could this backup battery storage unit target that inflexible load that otherwise could not be curtailed? Steve, I'm not sure if you want to elaborate any further on that.
No, well said. I look at demand response and behind the meter battery storage as like two sides of the same coin, right? You may not have flexibility, or you may have limited flexibility in your operations, right? A battery is a perfectly suited asset, right, to give you that flexibility. And then by participating in 5CP management or in a demand response or ancillary service program, in a lot of cases, you can use those revenues to pay for the battery, right? So it provides the same flexibility as a industrial load can, if they can turn down. But if you can't, then a battery is well worth your time investigating.
Yeah, and I think just to close out that thought, right? I know that the basis for this discussion today has been mainly around demand response. Grid Beyond is also working on behind the meter battery storage as well. We have the support of Constellation for a lot of those projects as well. So I'll just say for anyone on the call that it is interested in talking about battery storage, if your manufacturing process has a lot of inflexible curtailment load, reach out. We can have similar conversations like demand response for battery storage.
Wonderful. Well, I truly appreciate all of the work that the three of you put into today's event. I wish we had another hour, because I have a feeling that these questions would just keep coming in and coming in and coming in. So what that tells me is we'll need to do a follow-up event to continue the discussion in the future in 2026. So again, I know we had a lot of questions. We had 26 questions come in today from our attendees, which is amazing. So we truly, truly appreciate everybody's active participation. When I close out today's event, you will see a survey that pops up on your screen. If you could fill that out, we would appreciate it. You can also add additional information, ask any other questions. All of today's speakers, they will have contact information, so they will be able to get in touch with you. But again, please feel free to reach out to either of the Nicks or Steve, and I'm sure that they will be more than happy to speak with you. So thank you again for being on with us. Thank you, Grid Beyond, for sponsoring this event, and I hope everybody has a wonderful day.
Thank
you, Jessica. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.